betrayal rarely begins with an explosion. More often, it creeps in silently, like a shadow slipping under a door, until one day the room is swallowed whole. That's how it felt in my home. My own family, the people I had worked myself to the bone for, began to see me less as a father and husband, and more as some ordinary fixture in the background, like a chair that never moves, always there, never thanked. My name doesn't matter much, at least not to those who ought to have said it with respect. For most of my adult life, I was just Dad or Honey. I was the one who paid the electricity bills, the tuition fees, the groceries, the mortgage, and every little emergency that cropped up like weeds. I didn't complain. That's what men of my generation were taught: provide, endure, and keep your head down. My wife, Sarah, and I married young. She was the daughter of a man who carried himself like he owned every room he entered. My father-in-law, FIL, as I'll call him, was a man of charisma, polished suits, and smooth talk. He wasn't wealthy in the way people think of wealth, but he looked wealthy. He loved being admired. Every story he told painted him as the hero, how he could fix anything, how he once closed a deal worth thousands, how women adored him, how he was the cleverest man anyone had ever met. He loved attention like plants love sunlight, and he made sure no one forgot he was the pillar of the family. But here's the truth he never admitted: when it came to bills, when it came to actual responsibility, he was nowhere to be found. Not once did he hand me an envelope to help with rent, or step in when my son needed new school shoes. He was the man with the golden tongue, while I was the man with the aching back. For years I didn't mind. Let him be the entertainer, the adored one. I would be the quiet worker in the background. After all, what mattered was that my wife and son had a roof over their heads, food on the table, and opportunities in front of them. My son, Michael, was my pride and joy when he was small. He'd run into my arms after school, babbling about his day, and I'd listen, even when exhaustion gnawed at me. He once said, "Dad, when I grow up, I want to be just like you." That memory still stings now, because somewhere along the way, that admiration turned into disdain. It began subtly. Around the dinner table, my wife would laugh at one of her father's stories, then sigh and say something like, "My dad always knows how to handle people. You're too quiet sometimes." At first, it was harmless. But Michael's ears were always open. Children don't just listen. They absorb. By the time Michael was a teenager, he started comparing me to his grandfather. "Grandpa says you should invest. Grandpa says you don't know how to enjoy life. Grandpa says you're too serious." Every word was like a small cut. I kept silent. After all, isn't a father supposed to be patient? But silence has a cost. Over time, respect eroded. My role as provider became invisible, while my father-in-law's role as the charming storyteller became glorified. Michael began to look at me with something sharper than teenage rebellion. It was contempt. One evening, the confrontation finally came. It was after dinner, a simple Thursday, nothing special. Michael had asked me for money again. Something unnecessary, something extravagant. I told him no. My salary had already been stretched to cover tuition, rent, and bills, and I was saving what little remained for emergencies. That's when his voice cut through me like a blade. "You'll never measure up to Grandpa!" He shouted, his eyes blazing. "He's everything you're not!" Successful, respected, admired. "You're just boring. You're just a wallet that says no." I froze. For a moment, the world tilted. My own son, the boy I had raised with sweat and sleepless nights, stood there calling me less than the man who had never paid a single bill for him. I looked at him, not with anger, but with something heavier, the kind of sadness that sinks deep into your bones. Then I spoke. My voice was calm, even though my heart was breaking. "Will he pay your bills, Michael?" I asked quietly. The room fell silent. My wife looked away. Michael's defiance flickered for a moment, but then he stormed off, slamming his door like only teenagers know how. I stood there, staring at the empty hallway, my hands trembling. That was the night something inside me shifted. I realized that no matter how much I gave, They would never see me until I stopped giving. And so, a seed was planted. A seed of resolve watered by betrayal, that one day would grow into something they would never forget. The days after Michael's outburst were heavy with silence. It wasn't the kind of silence that brings peace, but the kind that rots the air. Every glance, every word carried an edge. My son avoided me unless he needed something, and Sarah acted as if nothing had happened, but her eyes told another story. There's a cruelty in being taken for granted. People don't even notice they're doing it. They just slip into it like it's the most natural thing in the world. Sarah had grown up on her father's words, his stories of triumph, his exaggerated heroics. She was so used to hearing him glorify himself that she started to believe my quiet, steady life was somehow less. You could learn to be a little more like my dad, she said one evening, as if she were commenting on the weather. She didn't mean it to cut, but it cut all the same. More like her dad. Her dad, who never once stayed awake with Michael when he had a fever, who never skipped a meal to make sure bills were paid, who never worked double shifts so his grandson could go to private school. Her dad, who strutted in with polished shoes and fake stories, leaving behind admiration like confetti, but never real support. I bit my tongue. Fighting her would solve nothing. And yet, the divide between us grew, brick by brick, until I felt like a stranger in my own home. Michael, meanwhile, took his grandfather's words as gospel. He'd spend hours with him, listening as the old man spun tales of how he once turned down a fortune because he had principles, or how he could have been a CEO if only he'd wanted the stress. Michael's eyes would glow with admiration, the same eyes that now rolled whenever I asked him to clean his room or focus on his studies. I was no longer his role model. I was the obstacle in his way. One Saturday, Michael came home waving a new gadget, a gaming console worth more than half a month's groceries. Grandpa said I deserve it, he declared proudly. I stared at it, then at Sarah, waiting for her to correct him, to say something about priorities. But she just shrugged, almost smug. I asked quietly, "And who paid for it?" Michael's smirk faltered. Grandpa, well, he said he'll figure it out. I already knew the truth. The man had never figured out a single expense in his life. And sure enough, a week later, when the bill arrived, Sarah slid it across the table to me without a word. That was the moment the betrayal became complete. Not from my son, not even from my father-in-law, but from my wife. She knew who was really paying, and still she allowed our son to believe the lie. Still she chose her father's image over my reality. That night, lying awake while the house slept, I stared at the ceiling with my fists clenched. I thought about all the years I had worked without complaint, all the times I denied myself small pleasures so they could have more. And for what? To be invisible in my own home. There comes a point when pain hardens into resolve. I reached it that night. I began to change quietly, the way storms begin far out at sea, unnoticed until the waves crash against the shore. First, I stopped volunteering money. When Michael asked for cash, I told him to ask his grandfather. Sarah frowned but said nothing. Then I started keeping track of every expense I carried. Tuition, utilities, groceries, car insurance, rent. Every line written neatly in a notebook. It wasn't for them. It was for me. A reminder that while they admired another man's charm, I was the one holding their world together. And still the disrespect continued. Michael once looked me straight in the eye and said, "You don't understand success. Grandpa says a real man makes people admire him. You're just ordinary." Ordinary. That word haunted me. Ordinary, as though steady sacrifice were worthless. Ordinary, as though breaking my back for his future made me invisible. But even as my heart broke, I didn't lash out. No, I waited. Because deep down, I knew the truth: admiration doesn't pay bills. Charisma doesn't keep the lights on. Sooner or later, the illusion would crumble. Revenge doesn't always come with fire and fury. Sometimes it arrives in silence. Slow, deliberate, almost gentle. Mine began that way. It started small. One evening, Michael asked me for money to go out with friends. I looked him dead in the eye and said, "Ask your grandfather. He's the one you respect, isn't he?" He frowned, confused, but brushed it off. When Sarah later pressed a few bills into his hand, I said nothing. That was the first cut in the safety net they had taken for granted. The second came with tuition. For years, I had been covering his private school fees, sacrificing vacations, hobbies, even new clothes just to keep him there. This time, when the invoice arrived, I quietly set it aside. A week later, Michael came storming into the kitchen.
"Dad, the school's saying the fee is overdue!"
"What's going on?" I kept my tone calm. "Ask your grandfather. I'm sure a man like him can handle it." His face flushed red, but before he could speak, I walked away. The silence that followed was heavier than any argument. And so it began. Every bill, every demand, every expense that once passed silently through my hands I left on the table. Electricity, groceries, car insurance, rent. Each one I ignored, each one I let sit like a ticking clock. Sarah tried to confront me one night.
"What are you doing? We can't live like this!"
I met her gaze, my voice steady. "For years, I carried this house on my back. You wanted your father to be the example, the hero. Then let him step in. Let's see how long his stories keep the lights on." She faltered, because deep down, she already knew the answer. Her father had never shouldered responsibility. But pride is a stubborn thing, and she couldn't admit it. Not yet. Meanwhile, the cracks began to show. The landlord called about late rent. The power company sent warnings. Michael's school threatened suspension over unpaid fees. Each time, Sarah would call her father, desperate, pleading. And each time, his excuses flowed as easily as ever. "Sweetheart, I'm a little tight right now. Investments, you know how it is. I'll sort it soon." Don't worry, these companies always exaggerate. They'll give you more time? You can't expect me to fix everything.
"That's your husband's job!"
The last excuse cut her the most, I think, because suddenly, the man she had idolized wasn't the savior she painted him to be. He was just a shadow, always shifting responsibility elsewhere. Michael, too, began to feel the weight of reality. The day his school barred him from class, he came home pale and shaken. He threw his backpack on the floor and glared at me.
"This is your fault!"
he shouted. I looked at him, calm as ever. Is it? Or is it the fault of the man you said was better than me? Did he pay your fees? Did he stand at that office today and fight for your education? No, because he never has, Michael. Never. The words hit him like stones, but still his pride held him back from admitting the truth. He stormed to his room, slamming his door just as he had weeks before. But this time, the sound carried less certainty. I could feel it. Doubt was beginning to creep into him. Every storm eventually reaches shore. Mine had been brewing for months, silent, invisible to the world outside our home, but relentless in its force. By the time it arrived, Sarah and Michael were already standing in the wreckage of their illusions. The electricity had been cut for 2 days when Michael finally broke. No glowing screens, no Wi-Fi, no warmth from the lights. He sat at the kitchen table, his face half lit by a candle, looking smaller than I had seen him in years. The proud defiance was gone. His shoulders sagged, his eyes hollow from restless nights. "Dad," he said at last, his voice cracking. "I'm sorry." Those words should have brought me instant relief, but they didn't. Not yet. Because apologies are easy when the world caves in. What mattered was whether he had truly learned. "What are you sorry for?" I asked quietly, my hands folded in front of me. He swallowed hard. For saying you'd never measure up. For thinking Grandpa was more than you. He talks big, but he never shows up. Not when it matters. His eyes shimmered with tears. You always did. Every day. I just didn't see it. The silence that followed was thick, broken only by the faint hiss of the candle flame. My chest ached, not with anger, but with the bittersweet sting of recognition. Finally, he was seeing me. Sarah, who had been standing at the sink, turned slowly. Her face was pale, her pride cracked open at last. She looked at me with eyes heavy with guilt. "I was wrong too," she whispered. I let him shape the way Michael saw you. I compared you to a man who never sacrificed anything for us. You were the one who kept us safe. I'll never forget that again. For a long moment, I let them sit in their sorrow, not to punish them, but because I wanted the weight of truth to settle deep, never to be forgotten. Then, slowly, I reached across the table and took Michael's hand. His fingers were trembling, but he didn't pull away. Respect, I said softly, isn't about admiration or flashy words. It's about sacrifice. It's about showing up, even when no one claps for you. Your grandfather tells stories. I lived mine quietly so you could have a future. That's the difference. Michael nodded, tears slipping down his cheeks. He squeezed my hand, and in that simple gesture, years of unspoken hurt began to heal. As for Sarah, she came to me later that night, when Michael had gone to bed. She stood in the doorway of our room, her voice low. I don't know if you can ever forgive me, she said, but I see it now. All these years, I looked at the wrong man as the example. You were the one who kept us safe. You were the one I should have honored. I'll never forget that again. I didn't answer immediately. Forgiveness isn't a switch you flip. It's a bridge rebuilt stone by stone. But I nodded because I knew she was sincere, and because carrying resentment would only poison me further. The sweetest part of my revenge was not their suffering, it was their awakening. To watch the false image of my father-in-law collapse. To see them finally understand who had truly carried them all along. That was enough. In the weeks that followed, I began paying the bills again, slowly restoring order to our home. But things were different now. Michael no longer demanded money with a sneer. Instead, he asked, Dad, how can I help? Sarah, too, spoke with more gratitude, less comparison. The air, though still scarred, felt lighter. As for my father-in-law, he eventually stopped coming around so often. Perhaps it was guilt, perhaps it was shame, or perhaps he simply didn't enjoy being around people who no longer hung on his every word. His absence was no loss to me. One evening, months later, Michael sat beside me on the porch. He was quieter these days, more thoughtful. He turned to me suddenly and said, You're the man I want to be, Dad.
Not Grandpa.
You. I closed my eyes, letting the words sink in. That was my victory, not loud, not vengeful, but sweet in its quiet truth. Because in the end, revenge didn't come from shouting or fighting. It came from letting reality reveal itself. From letting the people who betrayed me see the truth without me ever lifting a hand. And in that truth, I found both justice and peace.